December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve. While families across the world put candles in windows and sang songs, General Heinz Guderian stepped off his command train at the Adlerhorst, Hitler's Eagle's Nest headquarters buried in the Taunus Mountains, 10 miles northwest of Bad Nauheim. He had come all night from Zossen, south of Berlin, where the German Army High Command ran its operations from an underground bunker complex. He had not come to celebrate Christmas. He had come because he had seen the numbers, and the numbers were a death sentence for Germany. Guderian was the man who invented the Blitzkrieg. Literally. The fast, crashing armored assault that tore France apart in 6 weeks in 1940, that drove through Poland before the world had time to blink. They called him Schneller Heinz, Fast Heinz. He was 63 years old and his heart was giving out, but his mind was still the sharpest in the German High Command. And what his mind was telling him on that Christmas Eve was simple. The Eastern Front was about to collapse. He had the intelligence reports in his briefcase. The Eastern Intelligence Branch of German Army High Command had identified 225 Soviet infantry divisions and 22 armored corps massed between the Baltic Sea and the Carpathian Mountains. 225 divisions. That is not a number you misread. That is not a rounding error. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev had assembled 2.2 million men, 4,529 tanks, 13,763 artillery pieces, and 5,000 aircraft on the Vistula River line in Poland. Facing them, German Army Group A had 450,000 soldiers, 1,150 tanks, and 4,100 artillery pieces, 5-1, on the most important front of the war. Guderian walked into the room where Hitler sat and told him the truth. Stop the Ardennes offensive in the west. It is failing. Move everything east. The Russians are about to break through. He asked Hitler to evacuate the 30 German divisions trapped and isolated in Courland on the Baltic coast of Lithuania and bring them back to defend the gateways into Germany itself. Hitler looked at the intelligence report. Then he said something that tells you everything you need to know about why Germany lost the war. He called it, and this is a direct quote from the records of that meeting, the biggest imposture since Genghis Khan. He wanted to know who had produced all this rubbish. He refused to stop the Ardennes offensive. He refused to evacuate the Courland divisions. And he sent Guderian back to his train, cold, dark, Christmas. 19 days later, on January 12, 1945, the Soviet offensive opened. Konev's armies burst out of the Sandomier's bridgehead on the Vistula at 4:35 in the morning. The German frontline positions were gone by noon. The breach was 200 miles wide within 2 days. Soviet tank columns were moving 40 to 50 kilometers a day. The infantry was moving 30 kilometers a day. Warsaw fell on January 17th. Krakow fell on January 19th. Poznan was encircled by January 25th. By January 31st, Zhukov's spearheads had crossed the Brandenburg frontier and reached the Oder River at Kustrin, 64 kilometers from Berlin. Berlin was essentially undefended. The whole thing had taken 19 days. In 19 days, the Soviet army had advanced 480 kilometers from the Vistula to the Oder, Germany's eastern border, in 19 days. Guderian had been right about every single thing, and Hitler had ignored every single word. If you value documented, factual military history like this, the kind that goes beyond the myths and shows you what actually happened and why, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. And drop a comment telling us which city you are hearing this from. We want to know. Also, before we continue, this script is deeply researched and factual. The figures, dates, and quotes used here draw from the U.S. Army's official World War II history. Stalingrad to Berlin, the German defeat in the East, compiled by Earl Ziemke and published by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, a source that went through classified German and Soviet military records in the 1960s and remains the gold standard for Eastern Front operational history. The Vistula Oder intelligence data also comes from Warfare History Network's documented analysis of the Eastern Intelligence Branch of OKH, published in November 2022, citing original German Army records. This is not Wikipedia. These are the documents. Now, back to the story. Guderian kept going to Hitler. He would not stop. That is the thing about this man that you have to understand. He was not a coward. He was not a yes man. He was the one German general who would stand in front of Adolf Hitler and scream. In January of 1945, with the Soviets already pouring through the gap in the east, Guderian went back to the Adlerhorst again. He laid out the situation once more. He demanded reinforcements from the Western Front to be sent east. Hitler refused. He demanded Army Group South's armored divisions be redirected from Hungary to Poland. Hitler refused that too. Instead, Hitler sent the 6th Panzer Army not to the Eastern Front, but to Hungary, to protect the oil fields around Lake Balaton. Oil fields that were about to be encircled anyway. Guderian's memoirs, published in 1952 under the title Panzer Leader, describe these weeks as a grinding nightmare of screaming arguments and immovable stubbornness. He writes that Hitler's hands would shake, that he would lean over the map tables and insist on counterattacks with units that no longer existed, with supplies that had already been burned. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians were dying while Hitler waited for a miracle. The miracle he was waiting for was not a military plan. It was ideology. Hitler had become convinced, possibly by Frederick the Great's story of the 7 Years' War, that the Allied coalition would crack before Germany did. He called it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Frederick the Great had been on the verge of total defeat in 1762 when the Russian Empress Elizabeth died and the new Tsar Peter III pulled Russia out of the war, saving Prussia overnight. Hitler believed something similar would happen. The Americans and the Soviets would turn on each other. Churchill would come to his senses. The coalition would collapse. It did not collapse. It tightened. Meanwhile, to defend the collapsing gap in the center of the Eastern Front, the gap that Guderian had warned about for months, Hitler did something astonishing. He created a new army group, Army Group Vistula, and he put Heinrich Himmler in command of it. Himmler, the head of the SS, the man who ran the concentration camps, a man who had never commanded anything larger than a police unit. Guderian was livid. He fought Hitler directly on this appointment. He argued, he pleaded, he threatened to resign. Hitler refused to budge. Himmler took command of Army Group Vistula on January 25, 1945, and set up his headquarters in a private train parked at Deutsche Kronen. He ran the decisive front of the Eastern Front from a train. He barely left the train. He had no coherent strategy, no professional military education, and no plan beyond obedience to Hitler. Over 500,000 German soldiers were nominally under his command as the Red Army approached their positions. By February, the Soviets had bridgeheads across the Oder River. Berlin was 70 kilometers away. The city was, in the words of the American military historian Earl Ziemke, essentially open. Guderian understood what was coming. He tried again. He devised Operation Solstice, a counter-offensive using Army Group Vistula to drive back Zhukov's northern flank. He knew that if the flanks could be stabilized, there was at least a chance of slowing the Soviet advance enough to negotiate something with the Western Allies. It was not optimism. It was arithmetic. But Himmler could not lead the attack. Guderian knew it. In one of the most heated arguments of the entire war, Guderian confronted Hitler and demanded that General Walter Wenck be placed in actual command of the operation, with Himmler reduced to a figurehead. After hours of screaming, Hitler agreed. Wenck took operational command. The counterattack launched in February was a disaster anyway. The units were shattered remnants, undersupplied and undertrained. But at least it was not the total catastrophe it would have been under Himmler alone. Then Wenck's staff car crashed in the early morning of February 17th. Wenck himself had been driving because his driver fell asleep. He fell asleep too. The car hit the guardrail of a bridge over the Havel River near Rathenau, and Wenck suffered a fractured skull and 5 broken ribs. The best German officer in the theater was out of the fight for weeks. Guderian kept fighting, not on the battlefield, in the conference room. Every day, every military briefing in the Führer bunker in Berlin became a confrontation. Hitler would move phantom divisions across the map. He would order attacks by armies that were already destroyed. He would scream at generals for failing to hold positions with no ammunition and no reinforcements. Guderian would scream back. Officers standing in those rooms later said that Guderian's face would go purple, that the veins in his neck would stand out, that he would slam his fist on the table. He told Hitler directly that Germany needed to seek armistice negotiations. He told Hitler that the war in the East was already lost. He told Hitler that saving the civilian population in the East, the millions of Germans in East Prussia, in Pomerania, in Silesia, required immediate withdrawal to defensible lines, immediate evacuation of the trapped Courland divisions by sea. All of it was refused. By March of 1945, the situation was catastrophic everywhere. The garrison at Kustrin on the Oder was encircled. General Theodor Buss's Ninth Army attempted a relief operation to break through to the trapped men. It failed. The failure of that relief effort was the last straw. On March 28, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Heinz Guderian had the final argument. Both men screamed at each other. Hitler's staff stood frozen in the room. Officers who witnessed it said they had to physically step between the two men. Guderian was louder than Hitler. Nobody had ever been louder than Hitler in that room. Afterward, Hitler said, "I think you have had enough. You are relieved of command. You can go home now." He told Guderian to take 6 weeks of convalescent leave. General Hans Krebs replaced him as chief of staff of the army. Guderian was gone. The last voice in the high command that had been telling the truth was gone. He had survived more arguments with Hitler than any other German general. He had been fired in December of 1941 for pulling his men back from Moscow. He had been brought back in March of 1943 as Inspector General of Armored Troops, after Stalingrad proved the army needed someone who actually understood tank warfare. He had been made Chief of Staff of the Army on July the 21st, 1944, the day after the failed bomb plot against Hitler, partly because Hitler needed someone he could trust with the Eastern Front while he cleaned house, And now, on March 28th, 1945, with Soviet forces 50 miles from Berlin, he was told to go rest his heart. The Soviet offensive resumed on April 16th, 1945. Zhukov's first Belarusian front and Konev's first Ukrainian front drove into Germany. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers against approximately 1 million Germans in Army Group Vistula and Army Group Center. The Silo heights east of Berlin fell after 4 days of brutal fighting. By April 22nd, Soviet artillery was firing on the center of Berlin. By April 23rd, the city was encircled. By April 25th, the last link between the German Ninth Army and Berlin was severed. Himmler, who had been relieved of Army Group Vistula command on March 20th because he had collapsed under the pressure and retreated to a sanatorium at Hohenlychen, was by then trying to secretly negotiate with the Western Allies through Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte. He wanted to save himself. He failed at that too. He was captured after the Nazi surrender and killed himself on May 23rd, 1945. Hitler killed himself on April 30th, 1945, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Guderian, in Munich with his wife, treating his heart condition, surrendered to the American Army on May 10th, 1945. He spent 3 years in detention. He was not charged with war crimes at Nuremberg. He went home and wrote his memoirs. He died on May 14th, 1954, at 65 years old in Schwangau, Bavaria. And here's what makes this story cold. When Guderian walked into the Adlerhorst on Christmas Eve 1944 and laid down that intelligence report showing 225 Soviet divisions massed on the Vistula, he already knew Hitler would not listen. He knew it because he had been through this before. He had been dismissed in December of 1941 for retreating from Moscow without orders, for refusing to let his men freeze to death in a hopeless defense. He had been brought back only after Stalingrad destroyed the Sixth Army, and Germany needed someone who understood tanks again. He knew the pattern. He went anyway. He went because he believed that one more argument, one more set of numbers, one more direct confrontation might break through. It never did. If you value documented military history like this, not myth, not propaganda, but the actual decisions and the actual consequences, subscribe. It is the best way to keep this work going. Tell us in the comments what city you are hearing this from. The Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, who commanded the 8th Guards Army in the final assault on Berlin, wrote in his own memoirs that when his men crossed the Oder in January and faced almost no resistance for 70 kilometers, he believed Berlin could have been taken in February of 1945, 2 months before it finally fell. The scouts reported empty roads, empty fields, a city that did not yet know the war was at its door. The numbers that Guderian carried in that briefcase on Christmas Eve were not wrong. They were exactly right. Germany lost 1 million men in the first 4 months of 1945 alone, according to historians studying Wehrmacht casualty records from that period. Hundreds of thousands of civilians in East Prussia and Pomerania were overrun. The Wilhelm Gustloff, a passenger liner evacuating refugees from the east, was sunk by a Soviet submarine on January 30th, 1945, killing approximately 8,000 of the 9,000 people on board. The largest maritime disaster in history, 8,000 people in one night. All of this was in the future that Guderian could already see in December. He could see it because the math was simple. The army group defending Berlin had 450,000 men. The army coming to destroy it had 2 million. That is not strategy. That is arithmetic. And arithmetic does not care what you believe. Hitler called it the biggest imposture since Genghis Khan. The Red Army called it victory.